At 9:40 p.m. on the evening of February 15, 1898, the American battleship USS Maine lay quietly at anchor in Havana Harbor, Cuba. The ship had been there for 3 weeks, sent to protect American interests and citizens during a simmering rebellion against Spanish colonial rule. The night was calm. Most of the crew were aboard, many asleep or resting in their hammocks. Captain Charles Sigsbee was in his cabin writing a letter to his wife. Then, without warning, an enormous explosion tore through the forward part of the vessel. The blast ripped open the hull, ignited the forward ammunition magazines, and sent a column of fire and debris hundreds of feet into the air. Within minutes, the Maine sank in the shallow harbor mud. 266 American sailors and Marines were killed. Only a handful of the crew survived, many of them injured. In Havana, the sound was heard for miles. Within hours, the first dispatches went out by telegraph, and the news began its journey to Washington and New York. What happened? In the immediate aftermath, confusion reigned. The Spanish authorities in Cuba expressed condolences and offered assistance. The American Consul General, Fitzhugh Lee, urged restraint, but the American press did not wait for facts. Newspapers in New York owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer had been running sensational stories about Spanish atrocities in Cuba for months, whipping up public sentiment for war. The night of the explosion, the headlines were already being written. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain" became the rallying cry before any investigation could determine what truly caused the disaster. The United States Navy convened a court of inquiry within days. The board was chaired by Captain William T. Sampson, a respected naval officer. The investigation examined the wreckage, interviewed survivors, and considered the damage pattern. The board's report, released on March 28, 1898, concluded that the Maine had been destroyed by a submarine mine, which had then set off the forward magazines. The board did not accuse any individual or nation directly, but the implication was clear. A mine meant a deliberate act, and only Spain had motive and opportunity. The Spanish government conducted its own investigation, which concluded the explosion was internal, likely caused by a spontaneous combustion in a coal bunker adjacent to the magazines. Both sides held to their conclusions, and the United States Congress used the report as justification for a declaration of war against Spain on April 25, 1898. But the Maine explosion did not happen in a vacuum. To understand why that single event could ignite a conflict between a rising industrial power and an aging empire, we have to go back further. Cuba had been a Spanish colony since the 16th century. By the 1890s, it was one of the last remaining pieces of Spain's once vast American empire. The Cuban people had been fighting for independence since 1895. Waging a brutal guerrilla war against Spanish forces. The Spanish military response was harsh. General Valeriano Weyler, known as the Butcher, implemented a policy of reconcentration, forcing civilians into fortified towns to deprive the rebels of support. Tens of thousands of Cubans died from disease and starvation in these camps. American economic interests in Cuba were substantial. American companies owned sugar plantations and other businesses on the island. The instability threatened trade and investment. The United States had also long viewed Cuba through the lens of the Monroe Doctrine, the 1823 policy that declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to European colonization. A Spanish colony so close to Florida was a strategic concern. When the rebellion began, the administration of President William McKinley tried diplomacy first, pressing Spain to grant reforms and autonomy to Cuba. But Spain was unwilling to give up its last major colony without a fight, and the Cuban rebels would accept nothing less than full independence. Beyond the strategic and economic factors, there was something less tangible but equally powerful at work: the American mood. The nation had recovered from the Civil War and was emerging as an industrial powerhouse. It had built a modern navy, expanded its economy across the Pacific, and begun to think of itself as a world power. The idea of taking a place among empires was attractive to many Americans, who saw European nations carving up Africa and Asia. The historian Frederick Jackson Turner had declared the American frontier closed in 1893, and some argued that the nation needed new frontiers abroad. Missionary impulses, a belief in Anglo-Saxon superiority, and the desire for naval coaling stations all pushed the United States outward. So when the Maine exploded, the conditions for war were already set. The press played a crucial role. Hearst's New York Journal and Pulitzer's New York World competed for circulation by printing unverified stories about Spanish sabotage, heroic American sailors, and the need for revenge. They published sensational illustrations of the explosion and the sinking. They reported as fact that the Spanish had planted a mine, though no such evidence existed. They ignored the possibility of an internal accident. They helped transform a tragedy into a casus belli. President McKinley, who had been reluctant to go to war, was increasingly pressured by Congress, his own party, and the public. The Delome letter, a private Spanish diplomatic note stolen by Cuban rebels and published in February 1898, further inflamed tensions. In the letter, the Spanish ambassador to the United States, Enrique Dupuy Delome, called McKinley weak and insincere. The letter made Spain seem contemptuous and untrustworthy. By April, McKinley asked Congress for authority to use force to end the conflict in Cuba. Congress passed a joint resolution on April 20th demanding Spanish withdrawal and authorizing the president to use military force. The resolution included the Teller Amendment, which disclaimed any intention of annexing Cuba. Spain broke off diplomatic relations, and on April 25th, Congress declared that a state of war had existed since April 21st. The United States went to war with Spain. The Spanish-American War lasted only a few months, from April to August 1898, but it reshaped the world. The American strategy was twofold: attack the Spanish Navy in the Philippines, another Spanish colony on the other side of the globe, and send forces to Cuba. The first major battle took place in Manila Bay on May 1, 1898. Commodore George Dewey, commanding the American Asiatic Squadron, steamed into the harbor at dawn and destroyed the Spanish fleet anchored there. The Spanish ships were old, poorly maintained, and no match for Dewey's modern steel warships. The victory was complete. Not a single American sailor was killed in combat. The way was open to take Manila, though the city was not captured until August, after a mock battle arranged between commanders so that the Spanish could surrender honorably. In Cuba, the American Expeditionary Force was less prepared. The regular army was small, and the newly recruited volunteers were ill-trained, ill-equipped, and suffering from poor logistics. The most famous unit was the Rough Riders, a volunteer cavalry regiment led by Theodore Roosevelt, who had resigned his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to join the fight. They fought on foot, as their horses never arrived in Cuba. The decisive land battle came on July 1, 1898, at San Juan Hill, outside the city of Santiago. American forces, including the Rough Riders and the all-black 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments, stormed the Spanish fortifications under heavy fire. The Spanish defended bravely, but they were outnumbered and low on ammunition. By the end of the day, the heights were taken, and Santiago lay under siege. The Spanish fleet in Santiago Harbor attempted to break out on July 3rd and was destroyed in a running battle along the coast. Santiago surrendered on July 17th. By August, Spain agreed to an armistice, but the war was not just fought in Cuba and the Philippines. American forces also invaded Puerto Rico, taking the island without much resistance. The American goal was clear: to expel Spain from the Western Hemisphere and take control of its remaining colonies. The peace treaty, signed in Paris on December 10, 1898, gave the United States what it wanted. Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States and recognized Cuban independence. In exchange, the United States paid Spain $20 million for the Philippines. Cuba became a protectorate in all but name, subject to the Platt Amendment, which gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs and lease Guantanamo Bay as a naval base. The war made the United States an empire. It now controlled territories from the Caribbean to the Pacific. It had acquired a colony in Asia, the Philippines, which became a source of conflict for decades to come. The Filipino people, who had been fighting for independence from Spain, now found themselves under American rule. They turned their weapons against their new overlords, and the Philippine-American War broke out in 1899, lasting much longer and killing far more people than the Spanish-American War. The United States suppressed the insurrection brutally, using tactics similar to those it had condemned in Spain. The questions raised by the war did not end with the peace treaty. The sinking of the Maine continued to be debated for more than a century. In 1911, the United States finally raised the wreck from Havana Harbor and conducted a second investigation. That board also concluded that the explosion was caused by a mine, but critics pointed out flaws in the evidence. In 1976, a team led by Admiral Hyman Rickover reinvestigated using modern naval engineering knowledge. Rickover's team concluded that the most likely cause was a spontaneous coal bin fire that ignited the forward magazines, the exact explanation the Spanish had given in 1899. Later studies using computer modeling in the 1990 supported the coal fire theory, but no final answer exists. The wreck was sunk again in deep water in 1912, taking its secret with it. What remains is not just a question of forensic evidence. The story of the Maine shows how a single event, ambiguous and unexplained, can be pressed into service by larger forces. The war that followed had clear causes beyond the explosion: American expansionism, Cuban suffering, Spanish intransigence, and the power of the press. But the Maine served as the spark. It gave the advocates of war a moral cause, a reason to fight that seemed clear and righteous. The dead sailors of the battleship became martyrs, even though it is possible they were killed by an accident of their own ship. The Spanish-American War marked a turning point in American history. It ended American isolationism and began an era of overseas intervention that continues to shape foreign policy today. It transformed the United States into a colonial power, a role it had previously criticized in European nations. It also demonstrated the force of public opinion, amplified by mass media, in driving the nation to war. And it raised enduring questions about how wars begin, how evidence is interpreted, and who pays the price. The war itself was short, but its consequences were long. The men who died in Havana Harbor, in Manila Bay, on the slopes of San Juan Hill, and in the jungles of the Philippines all contributed to a new American empire. The nation that emerged from the war was not the same one that entered it. It was bigger, more confident, and more entangled in the world. The Spanish-American War was not just a conflict over Cuba. It was the moment the United States stepped onto the global stage, carrying the hopes, the ambitions, and the contradictions that would define the next century. The opening segment ends here. The next continuation will explore the specific battles, the human experiences of soldiers and sailors, the role of race and empire in shaping the aftermath, and the long shadow cast by this brief but transformative war. At 6:40 a.m. on July 1st, 1898, American artillery opened fire on the Spanish defenses atop San Juan Heights, a ridge overlooking the city of Santiago de Cuba. The guns were a mix of field pieces and naval howitzers dragged into position by mules through muddy jungle trails. The shelling was meant to soften the Spanish positions before the infantry advanced. But the artillery was inaccurate. The gunpowder created thick white smoke that obscured the gunners' view, and the Spanish had fortified the heights for months. They dug trenches, laid barbed wire, and anchored their flanks on steep slopes and thickets. The American bombardment did little damage. The Spanish soldiers, many of them conscripts from Spain's colonial garrisons, stayed low in their trenches and waited. At 8 a.m., the order came to move forward. The American plan was to take two hills, San Juan Hill, the main objective, and Kettle Hill, a smaller rise to its left. The assault was supposed to be coordinated, with a supporting attack on the Spanish right flank, but nothing went as planned. The American forces were the 5th Army Corps, commanded by General William Rufus Shafter, a man so obese he could barely ride a horse and had to be transported in a wagon. Shafter was ill, suffering from gout and heat exhaustion. He gave his orders from a field hospital 2 miles behind the front. Communication was poor. The trails were narrow, the jungle dense, and the heat brutal. Soldiers in wool uniforms, weighted down with rifles, ammunition, and canteens, collapsed from heatstroke before they reached the staging area. The Rough Riders, the volunteer cavalry regiment led by Theodore Roosevelt, had arrived the night before. Their horses had been left behind in Florida because there was no room on the transports. They fought as infantry, but they kept their cavalry name. Roosevelt, then 39 years old, had resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to join the fight. He was second in command of the regiment, but he effectively led it because Colonel Leonard Wood had been promoted to command a brigade. Roosevelt was restless, ambitious, and determined to prove his manhood and his country's might. At 9 a.m., the advance began down a narrow trail that led to the San Juan River. The trail was soon clogged with troops, supply wagons, and ambulances. The Spanish spotted the bottleneck from their heights and opened fire with small arms and shrapnel. The Americans took casualties before they even reached the river. Soldiers dove into the mud. Officers shouted orders that were lost in the noise. Some units got lost in the undergrowth. Others were pinned down. The plan called for the infantry to cross the river, spread out, and then charge the hills. But the Spanish fire was accurate and relentless. The Americans could not move. Then, without a formal order, some units began to advance on their own. At about 12:30 p.m., the signal came, not from Shafter but from Brigadier General Samuel Sumner, who saw that the troops were stalled. He gave the order to take the heights. What followed was not a planned assault. It was a desperate, upward scramble against an entrenched enemy. The charge up San Juan Hill is often remembered as a heroic dash by the Rough Riders, but that is only part of the story. The main assault was carried out by the regular infantry, including the all-black 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments and the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments, the so-called Buffalo Soldiers. These were seasoned troops, many of whom had fought in the Indian Wars in the American West. They were among the best trained soldiers in the American Army. Roosevelt's Rough Riders charged Kettle Hill, a lower rise to the left, and then from there covered the infantry's advance on San Juan Hill. The Buffalo Soldiers fought alongside them, and in some accounts, the regulars reached the top first. Roosevelt himself later acknowledged the bravery of the black troopers, writing that they fought with the same courage and enthusiasm as the white volunteers. But racial tensions were high. White officers often underrated black soldiers. In the chaos of the battle, some white troops refused to salute or respect black officers. Yet on that hill, they fought and died together. The Spanish defenders were outnumbered and running low on ammunition. They had held out for hours, but the American numbers were overwhelming. By 1:30 p.m., the heights were taken. The Spanish retreated into Santiago, leaving behind their dead and wounded. The cost was heavy. American casualties on July 1st numbered 205 killed and 1,180 wounded. The Spanish lost an estimated 215 killed and 376 wounded. The Rough Riders alone suffered over 100 casualties, including about 36 killed. Among the dead on both sides were men whose names were never recorded, buried in shallow graves that were later lost to the jungle. What happened in the hours after the battle? The American victory was not complete. San Juan Heights controlled the road to Santiago, but the city itself was still held by the Spanish. The American army was exhausted, low on supplies, and ravaged by disease. Typhoid, yellow fever, and malaria spread through the camps. General Shafter, still sick, considered withdrawing. He sent a demand for surrender to the Spanish commander, General José Toral. Toral refused. The siege of Santiago began. Meanwhile, on July 3rd, the Spanish fleet attempted to break out of Santiago harbor. In a desperate run, the 4 armored cruisers and 2 destroyers steamed toward the open sea. The American fleet, waiting outside, closed in. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba lasted 4 hours. By late afternoon, every Spanish ship was either sunk, beached, or burning. The Spanish naval power in the Caribbean was destroyed. Santiago surrendered on July 17th. The human cost of the campaign was staggering, but it was not measured only in combat deaths. Of the approximately 5,400 Americans who died in the Spanish-American War, fewer than 400 were killed in action. The rest died from disease, typhoid, yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, and other tropical illnesses. The Army's medical corps was unprepared. Food rations, often contaminated, arrived in spoiled tins. Water sources were polluted. The camps were breeding grounds for mosquitoes and bacteria. The War Department had not planned for tropical operations. The troops, many of them young volunteers from farms and cities, had no immunity to the diseases they encountered. The survivors carried the scars for the rest of their lives. How could this have happened? The American military system in 1898 was designed for continental warfare, not overseas expeditions. The regular army was small, only about 28,000 men. The volunteers, who numbered over 200,000 by the war's end, were poorly trained and equipped. The Quartermaster Corps, which supplied food and equipment, was riddled with corruption and incompetence. Contracts for canned meat were given to companies that sold spoiled beef. The so-called embalmed beef scandal that later led to congressional investigations. The medical department lacked the funds and authority to enforce sanitation. The yellow fever epidemic in Santiago claimed hundreds of American lives, with some regiments losing half their men to the disease. It was a disaster that the public barely understood, overshadowed by the triumphant narrative of the naval victories and the charge up San Juan Hill. And what of the Spanish soldiers? They had fought stubbornly, knowing their cause was already lost. Spain had been in decline for decades. Its navy was obsolete, its economy weak, its colonial administration corrupt. The soldiers in Cuba were conscripts, many of them teenagers or older men, sent to a colony that few cared about. They suffered from hunger, disease, and low morale. The Spanish commanders knew they could not hold Cuba against a determined American assault, but they fought to preserve honor, to delay the inevitable, and to negotiate better terms. After Santiago fell, the Spanish government sued for peace. On August 12, 1898, an armistice was signed. The war was over in a little over 3 months, but the war did not end the fighting for everyone. In the Philippines, the American victory at Manila Bay was only the beginning. Commodore Dewey had destroyed the Spanish fleet, but the city of Manila itself was still held by Spanish troops. The Filipino insurgents, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, had been fighting Spain for years. They welcomed the Americans as allies, but the alliance was based on a misunderstanding. The Americans had no intention of granting independence to the Philippines. They wanted the islands as a coaling station and a stepping stone to Asian markets. After Manila was taken in a staged surrender on August 13th, the Americans and Filipinos turned on each other. The Philippine-American War erupted in February 1899. It would last over 3 years, kill hundreds of thousands of Filipinos and over 4,000 Americans, and leave a legacy of bitterness and violence that echoes to this day. The war also transformed the American domestic landscape. The return of the soldiers brought news of heroism and suffering. Theodore Roosevelt became a national hero, elected governor of New York later that year, then vice president, then president. The Buffalo Soldiers returned to a country that still denied them basic rights. Their bravery in Cuba was used by some to argue for racial equality, but the argument was largely ignored. The Teller Amendment had promised not to annex Cuba, but the Platt Amendment, passed in 1901, gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs and establish a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Cuba became a protectorate, its sovereignty limited by American power. The island would remain under American influence for decades. The war also had geographic consequences. The United States now controlled Puerto Rico, a territory whose people were not consulted. It acquired Guam and the Philippines, islands halfway around the world. It took Hawaii by annexation in 1898, brushing aside the claims of the native monarchy. It established a naval base at Pearl Harbor. The country had joined the ranks of imperial powers, a status it had once condemned in Europe. That empire would be costly, requiring naval bases, coaling stations, and a much larger military. It would pull the United States into conflicts in the Pacific and the Caribbean for the next century. What remains of the Spanish-American War in the American memory? It is often remembered as a short, victorious conflict, a splendid little war, as Secretary of State John Hay called it. But the word splendid obscures the cost, the thousands of dead from disease, the brutal occupation of the Philippines, the betrayal of Cuban and Filipino independence. It also obscures the racial hierarchy that shaped the war. White officers commanding black soldiers, white volunteers looking down on Cuban allies, American soldiers treating Filipinos as inferiors. The war was not simply a liberation of Cuba from Spanish tyranny. It was a land grab, a strategic expansion, a colonial conquest dressed in humanitarian language. Investigators who looked back on the war in later decades asked what had changed. They pointed to the lessons learned, the need for a modernized military, a medical corps, a navy capable of two-ocean operations, and a foreign policy that recognized America's global role. But they also pointed to what did not change: the willingness to use force to achieve economic and strategic goals, the tendency to underestimate the cost, and the habit of forgetting the human beings in the way. The Spanish-American War was the first step in a long American march into the world. It was a step taken quickly, with little debate, and with consequences that are still with us. The next chapter of this history would be the Philippine-American War, a conflict that would test the limits of American ideals and reveal the brutal side of empire. But that is a story for another episode. Right now, the sun sets over Santiago Bay, where the hulks of Spanish ships rust in the shallows. The American flag flies over El Morro Castle. The soldiers who fought on the heights are already starting to leave, some in coffins, some in hospital ships, some on troop transports headed home to parades and promotions. They carried with them the memory of what they had done and what had been done in their name. The empire was made. The war was over, but the legacy had only begun. On the morning of December 10, 1898, representatives of the United States and Spain gathered in the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the Quai d'Orsay in Paris. The Treaty of Paris was signed. The terms were harsh. Spain relinquished all claim to Cuba, ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States, and sold the Philippines for $20 million. The American commissioners, William R. Day, Cushman K. Davis, William P. Fry, George Gray, and Whitelaw Reid, had argued for weeks. The Spanish delegates resisted, but they had no leverage. Their navy was destroyed. Their army was defeated. Their treasury was empty. The treaty was signed at 8:45 p.m. local time. What happened next was not an end but a beginning. The treaty required ratification by the United States Senate. The debate that followed exposed a deep division in American society. On one side stood the imperialists, President McKinley, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Theodore Roosevelt, and most of the Republican Party. They argued that the United States had a duty to civilize and uplift the peoples of the new territories. They pointed to the strategic need for naval bases in the Pacific and the Caribbean. They warned that if the United States did not take the Philippines, Germany or Japan would. On the other side stood the anti-imperialists, former President Grover Cleveland, industrialist Andrew Carnegie, author Mark Twain, labor leader Samuel Gompers, and a coalition of Democrats, populists, and intellectuals. They argued that the Constitution did not allow the United States to rule colonies without granting their inhabitants the rights of citizenship. They said that annexation violated the very principles the war had been fought for: self-government and liberty. They warned that an empire would require a large standing army, heavy taxes, and endless wars. The Senate debate lasted 2 months. The vote was scheduled for February 6, 1899. The night before, a telegram arrived in Washington. It reported that fighting had broken out in Manila between American troops and Filipino insurgents. The timing could not have been more convenient for the imperialists. They argued that withdrawal now would mean abandoning American soldiers under fire. The Senate voted 57 to 27 to ratify the treaty. The United States had officially become a colonial empire, but the fighting in the Philippines was not a small skirmish. It was the beginning of a war that would last more than 3 years. At 8 p.m. on February 4, 1899, an American sentry named Private William W. Grayson shot and killed a Filipino soldier near the San Juan Bridge on the outskirts of Manila. Grayson later testified that he had been ordered to hold his position and that the Filipino had refused to halt. Within hours, the American command under General Elwell Otis launched a full-scale assault on the Filipino lines. The Philippine-American War had begun. It would be far bloodier and far longer than the Spanish-American War. How could this have happened? The alliance between the United States and the Filipino revolutionaries had always been one of convenience. Emilio Aguinaldo, the Filipino leader, believed that the Americans would help him achieve independence. He had returned from exile aboard an American naval vessel, had been supplied with weapons captured from the Spanish, and had been recognized as a military ally. But the American command in Manila had never promised independence. When Aguinaldo proclaimed a revolutionary government and drafted a constitution, the Americans treated it as a threat. The question was never whether the United States would recognize Filipino sovereignty. It was how soon the conflict would come. The war that followed was brutal. The American forces, numbering about 24,000 at the start, grew to over 70,000 by 1900. The Filipino forces, poorly equipped and scattered, relied on guerrilla tactics. They used the dense jungles, mountainous terrain, and civilian population to hide and resupply. The American response was harsh. General Otis imposed press censorship and banned reports of atrocities. General Arthur MacArthur, who replaced Otis in 1900, adopted a policy of concentration camps, similar to what the Spanish had used in Cuba. Villages were burned. Food supplies were destroyed. Civilians were relocated to controlled zones where disease and starvation were rampant. Prisoners were interrogated using methods that would later be called torture. The water cure, in which water was forced into a prisoner's mouth and nose until they confessed or died. The human cost of the Philippine-American War is still debated. American combat deaths numbered around 4,200, with nearly 3,500 wounded. Filipino losses are estimated between 200,000 and 1 million, the vast majority civilians who died from famine, disease, or military operations. The war also left a moral scar on the American military. Reports of atrocities reached the United States through letters from soldiers and reports from journalists. The anti-imperialists seized on these accounts. Mark Twain wrote a satirical essay, "To the Person Sitting in Darkness," attacking the hypocrisy of American policy. The Senate held hearings in 1902 to investigate allegations of war crimes. General Jacob Smith was court-martialed for ordering his troops to turn the island of Samar into a howling wilderness and to kill everyone over the age of 10. He was convicted of conduct unbecoming an officer and forced into retirement. But the war was not the only legacy of the Treaty of Paris. In Puerto Rico, the American military government quickly established a civil administration. The Foraker Act of 1900 created a civilian government with a governor appointed by the president, an elected House of Delegates, and an executive council appointed by Washington. Puerto Ricans were not granted U.S. citizenship, and they had no vote in Congress. The island became an unincorporated territory, a legal category that allowed the United States to hold territory without promising statehood. The economy was transformed. American corporations took over sugar, tobacco, and coffee plantations. The local population was displaced. The language of instruction in schools shifted from Spanish to English. The cultural and political identity of Puerto Rico was reshaped by American rule, a process that continues to this day. In Cuba, the occupation lasted until 1908. The American military government, led by General John R. Brooke and later General Leonard Wood, rebuilt the infrastructure, established a public school system, and launched a campaign to eradicate yellow fever. Major Walter Reed, an Army physician, led a team that proved the disease was transmitted by mosquitoes. The discovery saved countless lives and allowed the construction of the Panama Canal. But the occupation also imposed conditions. The Platt Amendment, passed by the U.S. Congress in 1901, required Cuba to agree not to sign treaties with foreign powers, not to acquire debt beyond its ability to pay, and to allow the United States to intervene to preserve order and independence. The amendment also granted the United States a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Cuba became a protectorate in all but name. The American military withdrew in 1902, but American economic and political influence remained. What do investigators find when they look back at the Spanish-American War and its aftermath? The official inquiries began almost immediately. The Dodge Commission, established by President McKinley in September 1898, investigated the War Department's handling of the mobilization and supply failures. The Commission's report, published in 1900, documented widespread incompetence, corruption, and neglect. The Quartermaster Corps had contracted for thousands of tons of canned beef that was chemically treated to conceal spoilage, the embalmed beef scandal. The meat was condemned by inspectors but still shipped to Cuba. The medical department had been undermanned and underfunded. The camps in Florida and Georgia had no proper sanitation. The Commission recommended a complete reorganization of the War Department, which led to the creation of the Army General Staff in 1903. The naval side was different. The Navy had performed well, thanks to the modernization efforts of Secretary Benjamin Tracy and the strategic thinking of Alfred Thayer Mahan. The victory at Manila Bay and the blockade of Santiago had been carried out with professional competence. But the Navy also faced scrutiny. The loss of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor had been blamed on a Spanish mine, but later investigations in 1911 and 1976 suggested that the explosion was more likely caused by an accidental coal dust explosion in an adjacent bunker. The cause remains uncertain. The Maine was raised in 1911, and the remains of the crew were reburied in Arlington National Cemetery. The ship's hulk was scuttled in the ocean. The mystery never fully resolved. The Spanish-American War also reshaped the American presidency. McKinley had been a cautious leader, reluctant to go to war, but once the conflict began, he embraced its expansionist outcomes. He was assassinated in September 1901, and Theodore Roosevelt became president. Roosevelt was the embodiment of the new American imperialism, aggressive, confident, and unapologetic. He oversaw the construction of the Panama Canal, added the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and sent the Great White Fleet around the world. The United States was no longer a continental republic. It was a global power with interests in Asia, Latin America, and the Pacific. The war also changed the American military itself. The regular army was expanded to over 60,000 men. The National Guard was reorganized and professionalized. The Navy built more battleships and established coaling stations in Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines. The Army Medical Corps was reformed, with new emphasis on tropical medicine and sanitation. The lessons of the war were written into manuals and curricula at West Point and the Naval War College. The United States entered the 20th century with a military that could project power across oceans. but it also entered with a willingness to use that power without full public debate or oversight. Why does the Spanish-American War still matter? The answer lies in the pattern it set. The war established a precedent for humanitarian intervention that could quickly escalate into territorial acquisition. It showed that the United States would use military force to open markets and secure strategic positions, even if it meant suppressing local populations. It created a legal framework for colonies, the unincorporated territory, that allowed the United States to hold land without granting its people the full rights of citizenship. This framework still governs Puerto Rico, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and American Samoa. The war also introduced the idea of preemptive strikes and regime change, seen in the sinking of the Spanish fleet before a formal declaration of war, and the support for Panamanian independence in 1903. The war shaped American racial attitudes. The troops who fought in Cuba and the Philippines came from a country that was deeply segregated. Black soldiers who served bravely found that their service did not earn them equal treatment at home. The insurrectos in Cuba and the Filipinos were often described in racial terms, as childlike or savage, in need of American guidance. This language of racial hierarchy justified colonial rule and influenced later interventions in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua. The war also made the United States a Pacific power, setting the stage for the eventual conflict with Japan in World War II. What remains unexamined? The voices of the people who lived under American rule, the Cuban farmers who saw their land bought by American sugar companies, the Puerto Rican laborers who were forced to work for low wages, the Filipino mothers who lost children to disease and starvation, the Spanish soldiers who died on distant islands for a fading empire. Their stories are harder to find. The official records, the photographs, and the monuments celebrate the American victory, not the human cost. By the end of 1900, the war in the Philippines was still raging. The American public had grown weary of the news of skirmishes and casualties. McKinley won re-election that year on a platform of prosperity and imperialism, defeating William Jennings Bryan, who had campaigned on anti-imperialism. The war in the Philippines finally ended in 1902 with the capture of Emilio Aguinaldo in March 1901. He swore allegiance to the United States and called for peace. But the fighting continued in some areas until 1903. The island of Samar was only pacified after the harsh campaign led by General Jacob Smith. The Spanish-American War was over. The empire was built. The legacy had only begun. The United States now held territory from the Caribbean to the Pacific, a chain of bases and colonies that would project American power for decades. The war had brought fame to Roosevelt, reform to the military, and a new role in the world. But it had also brought death, disease, and destruction on a scale that the public preferred not to examine too closely. In the years that followed, the war was romanticized. Films, books, and monuments depicted the charge at San Juan Hill, the sinking of the Maine, and the heroism of the Rough Riders. The darker aspects, the scandals, the atrocities, the betrayal of allies were pushed aside. The war became a foundation myth for the American century, but the myth obscured a more complicated reality. The Spanish-American War was not a war of liberation. It was a war of expansion. It was not a war to end Spanish tyranny. It was a war to replace it with American control. And the consequences of that choice are still being felt today in the unresolved status of Puerto Rico, the presence of Guantanamo Bay, and the legacy of violence in the Philippines. What the investigators found in the end was not a single failure but a series of them. The failure to prepare for disease, the failure to plan for occupation, the failure to understand the aspirations of the people being liberated, the failure to question the moral authority of conquest. The war was a case study in unintended consequences, a lesson that power, once unleashed, does not always follow the script written by statesmen and generals. The United States emerged from the Spanish-American War as an empire, but it was an empire without a theory, without a plan, and without an exit. That absence of a plan would haunt every subsequent intervention, from the Philippines to Vietnam to Iraq. The sun sets on the Santiago Bay. The rusting wrecks of Spanish ships lie in the shallows, their hulls visible at low tide. The American flag still flies over Guantanamo. The empire that was made in 1898 is now more than a century old. It is no longer called an empire. It is called a global presence, a network of alliances, a responsibility. But the question remains the same as it was in 1898. What is the price of empire and who pays it? The answer is written in the graves of thousands of soldiers, the displaced villages of Puerto Rico, and the long memory of the Filipino people. The war that made an empire also made a long, unresolved story, and that story is still being written. On the morning of December 10th, 1898, at the signing of the Treaty of Paris, American and Spanish delegates gathered in the French capital to finalize the terms of surrender. The treaty was signed inside a stately building on the Quai d'Orsay. The document was written in French and Spanish. The American negotiators, led by former Secretary of State William R. Day, insisted on full Spanish withdrawal from Cuba and the cession of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Spain refused at first, but the Americans offered $20 million as compensation for the Philippines. Spain accepted. The treaty was signed, and the United States became a colonial power, but the treaty did not end the conflict. In the Philippines, the insurgency against Spanish rule had already transformed into a rebellion against the American occupation. By the time the treaty was ratified, the Filipinos had declared an independent republic, with Emilio Aguinaldo as its president. The Americans considered this declaration illegitimate. The stage was set for a new war. At 2 a.m. on February 4th, 1899, a shot rang out near the San Juan Bridge in Manila. An American sentry fired on a Filipino soldier crossing into a disputed zone. The American command claimed the Filipino was armed and refused to halt. The Filipino witnesses said the soldier was unarmed and was simply walking home. No one knows the absolute truth, but the single shot triggered a full-scale battle. Within hours, American troops had opened fire on Filipino positions across the city. The Philippine-American War had begun. What happened next was not a clean campaign. American forces, numbering about 20,000 at the start, faced a Filipino army that was poorly equipped but highly motivated. The Filipinos used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and booby traps. The Americans responded with overwhelming force, burning villages, destroying crops, and relocating civilians into concentration zones. The war would last 3 years officially, and guerrilla fighting continued for a decade. The American military command had severely underestimated the Filipino resistance. Intelligence reports before the outbreak had suggested that the Filipinos were disorganized and would welcome American rule. That was a catastrophic error. The Filipino soldiers had been trained by Spanish officers and had been fighting for years. They knew the terrain. They had the support of much of the population. The American forces, many of whom had volunteered for the Spanish-American War expecting a short campaign, were now stuck in a brutal counterinsurgency. In March 1899, the Americans launched a major offensive to crush the Filipino army in the field. The Battle of Manila was followed by the Battle of Caloocan, where American artillery shelled the town without regard for civilian casualties. In June, the Battle of Zapote Bridge saw the Filipinos hold the line for a full day before retreating. By November, Aguinaldo had split his forces and retreated into the northern mountains. The Americans pursued, but the guerrilla war intensified. In 1900, President McKinley appointed William Howard Taft to head the Philippine Commission, a civilian authority meant to establish American control. Taft believed in benevolent assimilation, the idea that the United States could rule the Philippines for the Filipinos' own good. But on the ground, the war was anything but benevolent. American soldiers reported widespread atrocities, the summary execution of prisoners, the torture of suspected guerrillas, and the burning of entire villages. The use of the water cure, a form of forced drowning, became routine. One officer wrote home that the war was making the army into a gang of murderers. How could this have happened? The United States had entered the Spanish-American War with a stated purpose of liberating Cuba. The Philippine insurrection, as the Americans called it, was supposed to be a continuation of that liberation. But the language of liberation quickly turned into the language of pacification. The military command, under General Elwell Otis and later General Arthur MacArthur, adopted a policy of severe repression. The governor of the occupied areas was given broad powers to arrest, detain, and deport anyone suspected of aiding the guerrillas. The system that failed was the system of civilian oversight. The American public, after the initial excitement of the Spanish-American War, had grown tired of the news from the Philippines. Newspapers covered the war, but the coverage was often limited to casualties and victories. The more disturbing stories, those about American atrocities, were slow to reach the mainland. When they did, they provoked outrage. In 1902, the American Anti-Imperialist League, led by Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and others, launched a campaign to expose the brutality. Twain wrote mock responses to the war, calling it a murderous expedition. But the damage was done. Investigators later examined the conduct of the war. A Senate committee, known as the Lodge Committee, took testimony from soldiers and officers. The hearings revealed a pattern of systematic brutality. One witness described the water cure being administered to a Filipino priest until he gave up information. Another testified that orders had been given to kill every man over the age of 10 in certain villages. General Jacob Smith, commanding on the island of Samar, had issued a notorious order to turn the island into a howling wilderness. He was court-martialed and retired, but no senior officer was punished for the overall conduct of the campaign. The war in the Philippines officially ended on July 4, 1902, when President Roosevelt declared that the insurrection was over. But the fighting continued on some islands, especially among the Muslim Moro people in the South. The Battle of Bud Dajo in 1906, where American forces killed an estimated 600 Moro men, women, and children in a crater, was another atrocity that drew condemnation. The war did not truly conclude until 1903. The human cost was staggering. An estimated 20,000 Filipino soldiers were killed in combat. Between 200,000 and 500,000 Filipino civilians died from disease, famine, and violence. American deaths numbered over 4,000. The war cost the United States about $400 million, more than the entire Spanish-American War. Why does this still matter? The Philippine-American War established the template for American counterinsurgency operations throughout the 20th century. The use of civilian relocation, the reliance on local informants, the targeting of villages, and the disregard for international law became hallmarks of later conflicts in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The war also demonstrated that the United States was willing to use extreme force to maintain its overseas possessions. The anti-imperialist movement that rose in response to the war did not succeed in ending colonialism, but it did create a lasting debate about the morality of American power. The war also shaped the relationship between the United States and the Philippines. After the war, the Americans built schools, roads, and hospitals. They introduced English as a common language. They established a civil service and a legal system, but these improvements came at a price. The Philippines remained an American colony until 1946. The memory of the war, suppressed in American textbooks, lived on in Filipino oral tradition. It is still a source of resentment and distrust. In 1901, after the capture of Emilio Aguinaldo, the American authorities brought him to Manila. He took an oath of allegiance to the United States and called for his followers to lay down their arms. But many did not trust the pledge. They remembered the broken promises of the Americans during the war. Aguinaldo himself later withdrew from public life, living quietly in his hometown until World War II. The war also had an impact on the American military. The experience in the Philippines taught officers the importance of intelligence, cultural understanding, and non-kinetic operations. But it also proved that the army could quickly revert to cruel tactics when faced with stubborn resistance. The lessons were contradictory and were seldom taught. What else remains unexamined? The role of African American soldiers in the Philippine War. Many black soldiers served in the segregated units of the regular army, and they were given the dangerous task of patrolling and fighting. Some of them were horrified by the racial language used by white officers to describe the Filipinos. Black newspapers in the United States highlighted the hypocrisy of Americans fighting for freedom abroad while denying it at home. The war deepened the racial divisions that would persist for generations. The treaty itself left unresolved issues. The Platt Amendment, passed in 1901, gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs and lease Guantanamo Bay as a naval base. This arrangement remained in place for more than a century. Puerto Rico became an unincorporated territory, subject to American laws but without voting representation in Congress. The people of Puerto Rico were made American citizens in 1917, but they still do not have the same rights as citizens living in a state. Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands remain territories today. The Philippines became independent only after a long battle, and its economy was heavily dependent on the United States. In the final months of 1900, as the presidential election approached, anti-imperialist candidates tried to make the war an issue. But William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic nominee, was defeated by McKinley. The American public, by a narrow margin, chose to continue the imperial path. The war was not over, but the debate was closed for the moment. By 1903, the Americans had suppressed the remaining pockets of guerrilla resistance. The Pharaohs, as the guerrilla bands were called, had been hunted down by the Philippine Scouts, a local force trained and led by American officers. The island of Leyte was pacified by the use of hunger and disease. The island of Jolo was brought under control after a series of bloody battles with the Moro fighters. There is a photograph from 1902, taken in a village on the island of Panay. It shows an American soldier standing over a pile of Filipino corpses. The soldier is smiling. The caption on the back, written in pencil, says only, "Good work." The photograph was eventually published in anti-imperialist literature and later found its way into the archives of the United States National Archives. It is a small, chilling testament to what the war had become. The war in the Philippines was not a side note to the Spanish-American War. It was its logical conclusion. The United States did not defeat Spain to free a colony. It defeated Spain to claim control over strategic territories. When the people of those territories resisted, the United States crushed them. The war was a preview of the 20th century. Now, with the treaty signed and the empire built, the question of what kind of empire it would be remained. The Americans had promised self-government to the Filipinos, but the promise was deferred indefinitely. They had promised civil rights to Puerto Ricans, but those rights were limited. They had promised to respect Cuban sovereignty, but the Platt Amendment made a mockery of that promise. The Spanish-American War had been sold as a war of liberation. It ended as a war of occupation. In the years that followed, historians would debate whether the war was a necessary step in the growth of the United States or a tragic abandonment of its founding ideals. The debate continues. The monuments stand. The graves remain. The people of the territories still ask for their autonomy. The empire that was made in 1898 is still present, even if it is no longer called an empire. And so, as the lights go out on the Memorial Hall of the Spanish-American War, one can only wonder what the soldiers who fought there would think of the world they helped create. They went to war for a cause they believed was just. They returned to a country that had changed. Some of them had changed. And the story they left behind is not a simple story of heroes and villains. It is a story of ambition, miscalculation, and consequence. It is a story that still has no final chapter. The war that made an empire also made a long, unresolved story, and that story is still being written. At 2:30 p.m. on April 12, 1900, President William McKinley signed the Four-Acre Act into law in the White House. The document, officially titled "An Act Temporarily to Provide Revenues and a Civil Government for Puerto Rico," was the first major piece of legislation to define the legal status of a territory acquired from Spain. The act established a civil government for Puerto Rico, with a governor appointed by the president, an executive council, and a House of Delegates elected by the people. But the act also imposed a 2% tariff on Puerto Rican goods entering the United States, and it did not grant American citizenship to the people of the island. What happened next? The Four-Acre Act was passed after months of debate in Congress. The anti-imperialists argued that the United States had no right to rule a foreign people without their consent. They demanded that the territories be granted self-government or eventual statehood. The imperialists, led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, argued that the Constitution did not automatically extend to the new possessions. They said the territories could be governed as colonies, like the British Empire did. The Supreme Court soon had to decide. In a series of cases known as the Insular Cases, the court ruled that the Constitution did not fully apply to the territories. In Downs v. Bidwell in 1901, the justices held that Puerto Rico was inhabited by alien races, differing from us in religion, customs, laws, methods of taxation, and modes of thought. Therefore, the entire Constitution did not follow the flag. The people of Puerto Rico were neither citizens nor subjects. They were something new, unincorporated territory, a possession but not a part of the United States. How could this have happened? The reasoning of the court was rooted in racial hierarchy and economic interest. The justices feared that granting full rights to Puerto Ricans would allow Asian and Latin American people to become American citizens. They also wanted to protect American businesses from competition with sugar and tobacco from the islands. The Insular Cases created a legal framework that persists today. Puerto Rico remains an unincorporated territory, subject to Congress but without voting representation. The people of Guam, the Virgin Islands, and the Northern Mariana Islands remain in the same status. The Four-Acre Act also had an immediate economic impact. The tariff on Puerto Rican goods hurt the island's economy. American corporations moved in to buy up land and control the sugar industry. The local population, once landowners, became wage laborers. The population grew, but the economy did not diversify. When the tariff was removed in 1901, it was replaced by a quota system that limited how much sugar Puerto Rico could sell to the mainland. The island became dependent on a single crop. By 1902, the first elected delegates to the Puerto Rican House of Assembly took office, but their power was limited. The governor and the executive council were appointed by the president. The governor could veto any law, and the United States Congress could override the legislature at any time. The people of Puerto Rico had a voice but not a vote. On the island, the response was mixed. Some leaders, like José Celso Barbosa, accepted the Four-Acre Act as a step forward. They believed that American citizenship and eventual statehood would bring prosperity. Others, like Luis Muñoz Rivera, rejected the act as a colonial charter. They demanded full autonomy. The debate over Puerto Rico's status has continued ever since. In 1917, the Jones-Shafroth Act granted American citizenship to Puerto Ricans, but it did not change the territory's political status. The people could now serve in the military and pay taxes, but they still could not vote for president or have a voting member in Congress. The citizenship was a gift, but it came with limits. What about the other territories? Guam, captured by the United States in 1898, was placed under the control of the Navy Department. The naval governor ruled with absolute authority. The people of Guam were not citizens. They had no representation, no civil rights, and no hope of statehood. The Chamorro language was suppressed, and American culture was imposed. Guam became a military outpost, not a colony. The Philippines was governed by a commission. The Philippine Commission, appointed by the president, wrote laws and collected taxes. In 1901, The commission was expanded to include Filipino members, but the power remained with the Americans. The first Philippine Assembly was elected in 1907, but the governor could veto its decisions. The Organic Act of 1902 promised eventual independence, but no timeline was given. In Cuba, the American occupation ended in 1902, but the Platt Amendment allowed the United States to intervene at any time. The amendment was forced into the Cuban Constitution. It gave the United States the right to lease Guantanamo Bay and to veto Cuban treaties. The Americans claimed they were protecting Cuban independence. In practice, they were controlling it. The war that made an empire also made a system of unequal rights. The people of the conquered territories were not equal to the people of the mainland. They were subjects, not citizens. The Supreme Court's rulings in the insular cases created a legal apartheid that lasted for decades. By 1904, the United States had built a naval base at Pearl Harbor, taken control of the Panama Canal Zone, and established military bases in Cuba and Puerto Rico. The empire was no longer just an idea. It was a network of islands and strategic points across the Atlantic and Pacific. The Spanish-American War had transformed the United States from a continental republic into a global power, but the transformation came at a cost. The war had cost the lives of over 3,000 American soldiers, most of them from disease. The Philippine-American War had cost over 4,000 American lives and hundreds of thousands of Filipino lives. The economic cost of the empire, including the cost of occupation, tariffs, and military construction, had risen to over $1 billion by 1900. The benefits of the empire, such as new markets and strategic positions, were not equally shared. The profits went to corporations, not to the people. By 1914, the United States was a different country. It had an overseas empire, a large navy, and a new sense of global mission. The Spanish-American War had been a turning point, but not everyone had turned in the same direction. The anti-imperialists, though defeated, had left a lasting mark. Their arguments about self-determination, racial equality, and constitutional law would be revived in later generations. The war also changed the way Americans thought about themselves. The idea of manifest destiny, which had once applied only to the continent, now extended across the ocean. The United States was no longer content to be a passive observer in world affairs. It would intervene, conquer, and rule. The rhetoric of freedom and democracy would be used to justify domination. What remains unexamined? The story of the war is often told as a brief, glorious conflict that gave the United States an empire. But the empire was not given. It was taken, and the taking involved blood, deceit, and loss. The war also created a pattern. The United States would fight a war, claim to liberate a people, and then impose its own rule. That pattern repeated itself in Latin America, in the Middle East, and in Asia. The Spanish-American War was not an exception. It was the prototype. And so the story is still being written. The territories remain. The citizenship remains limited. The debates over statehood, independence, and freedom continue. The war that made an empire did not end in 1898. It ended, if it ended at all, in the ongoing struggle of the people of Puerto Rico, Guam, and other territories to claim their place in the American experiment. The war is not over. It is still being fought, not with bullets, but with ballots, petitions, and court cases. And the question that the war raised about whether a republic can rule an empire has still not been answered.